Good morning. My name is Rebecca West, and I teach here in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, and also in the Department of Cinema and Media Studies. I've been at the university for 36 years. I came here for my first position, and I've never left. And I'm happy that I never did leave. Thank you all so much for coming this morning. And I'm going to talk to you relatively briefly, so we'll have some time for discussion and questions and comments and so on. And I'm also going to be showing you a very short film, which I'll explain in the course of my talk. This is, by the way, the session on Valentino, in case you're not in the right place. Rudolph Valentino was born in 1895 in the small town of Castellaneta, Italy, which is located in the southern region of Puglia. His birth name was Rodolfo Guglielmi, and his mother was French, his father Italian. Rodolfo had 3 siblings: his older brother Alberto, his younger sister Maria, and another older sister, Beatrice, who died in infancy. Nothing about his early life would indicate that in the future, Rodolfo would have become the world's most famous Latin lover, nor that we would still be talking about him more than 80 years after his tragically premature death in 1926. His was a typical small-town childhood and adolescence. He was not an especially talented or accomplished child. And before he left for the United States in 1913, at the age of 18, he had already failed in his attempts to become a career soldier or a veterinarian like his father. Having lost his father when he was 11 years old, Rodolfo was evidently coddled and spoiled by his doting mother, and she made sure that he had money for expenses when he sailed for America, off on a kind of reverse grand tour of the New World. But young Rodolfo soon ran through his travel funds as he indulged his taste for high living in New York, and he ended up waiting on tables, doing yard work, and even sleeping on park benches for a brief period. It was when he became a taxi dancer, one of many handsome young men who danced with ladies for money, that his talents began to show themselves. He was a wonderful dancer, a seductively exotic physical type, and he loved to please the ladies, who in turn loved to be pleased by him. His film career took off when he was noticed by screenwriter June Mathis, one of the many women who helped him to stardom. With behind him a youthful failed marriage to the actress Jean Acker, a couple of messy scandals involving the infidelities, adulteries, and other hijinks of high-living acquaintances of his, and a charge of bigamy when he married his second wife, the costume and set designer Natasha Rambova, aka Winifred Hudnut. Before he was legally divorced from Jean Acker, whom he had married in 1919, Rodolfo, who had by then taken on the name of Rudolph Valentino, was a media sensation, and this by the time he was in his mid-20s. The great success of films such as The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and The Sheik assured his fame. Given the brief time I have to talk with you today, I won't go into all of the fascinating details of Valentino's rise to success. You can read his entire life story in Emily Leiter's very well done biography entitled Dark Lover, if you're interested in a step-by-step account of his life and fortunes. Instead, I want to talk about some little-known aspects of his undertakings. His book of poetry, published in both England and the United States in 1923, and his travel diary, published serially in the magazine Movie Weekly, and then in England and the United States, also in 1923. Before doing so, however, I want to talk a bit about the reception of Valentino in the United States, as well as about how his public identity was a study in contradictions. Valentino had many identities in the public press. He was, of course, best known as a Latin lover, but he was not universally beloved. The divide was mostly along gender lines. The women viewers of his films loving him, and most of the men disliking him intensely for his dandyish ways. He was also seen as a threatening figure due to his dark looks and his foreignness, which made of him someone, for some of the audience and press people, someone who was uncomfortably close to races of color. The movie industry attempted to counter the implications of his feminine softness by creating images and promoting fan magazine articles about his athleticism and his he-man interests in sports and physical fitness. His exoticism and darkness were countered with articles about his all-American domestic life, his love of cooking and palling around with the guys, and his all-round normalcy as just one of the boys. Another ploy was to associate him strongly with aristocratic old-world culture and to emphasize his love for classical music, art, and literature. As is immediately evident, the movie star Valentino was constructed from many different, even contradictory angles, and he became a kind of litmus test for the desires, anxieties, and prejudices of his American public. The implication of homosexuality became explicit with an article in the Chicago Tribune in 1926, shortly before his death, when an unnamed author talked with disdain about the installation of a face powder dispenser in the Chicago Aragon Hotel's men's room, attributing this feminization of the American man to Valentino's influence. The unknown author wrote, "A powder vending machine in a men's washroom? Why didn't someone quietly drown Rudolph Guglielmo," gets the name wrong, alias Valentino, years ago? Known for wearing all sorts of exotic, often feminizing costumes in his films, many of which were designed by his wife Natasha, as well as for his perfumed, sleekly pomaded hair, his graceful dancing, and his languidly sexy manner, he was a relatively easy target for ridicule by he-men types. Valentino was infuriated by the article. He felt not only his manhood, but also his good family name and his proud Italian heritage had been insulted. Caring deeply about honor, as any Southern Italian man had learned to from infancy, Valentino challenged the Tribune columnist to fight it out in a duel or a boxing match, but neither challenge was answered. He also met with the journalist H.L. Mencken shortly after this piece appeared in the Tribune for advice on how to deal with the situation. But Mencken told him best to, quote, "let the dreadful farce roll along to exhaustion." Valentino was assailed on all sides at this point in his life and career. The Italian fascist government was furious with him for having filed for American citizenship. He was not getting the serious dramatic roles in films that he so badly wanted. His second marriage to Natasha had ended in divorce, and he was suffering terribly the effects of an untreated gastric ulcer, which was worsened by his incessant smoking and his unhealthy diet. He died very shortly after the meeting with Mencken in 1926, and Mencken wrote a piece for the Baltimore Sun after Valentino's death, in which he defended the young star, saying that when they met, Valentino had been suffering not just from the, quote, trifling Chicago episode, but, quote, from the whole grotesque futility of his life. Mencken found Valentino's words, quote, simple and yet somehow very eloquent. he saw him as, quote, curiously naive and boyish, as a young man who, quote, had some obvious fineness in him. The journalist concluded that Valentino was a gentleman in the real sense of the word, and that Valentino's agony, which came through in their brief encounter, was the agony of a, quote, man of relatively civilized feelings thrown into a situation of intolerable vulgarity, destructive alike to his peace and dignity. The meeting between Mencken and Valentino was made into a short film by the young actor and filmmaker Eduardo Bobbidi, which I will show you at the end of my presentation. This short movie is called Good Night, Valentino, and I think it's one of the best cinematic portrayals of Valentino ever, capturing as it does, through Bobbidini's sensitive performance as the star, his mix of pride, grace, and anguish. By the way, Eduardo Bobbidi is the son of an Italianist, a professor of Italian, whom I have known my entire career. And I knew Eduardo Bobbidi when he was about 1 year old. He's now, I believe, about 40. But you'll see what an excellent portrayal of Valentino he succeeds in giving in this short film. Before showing you the film, however, I want to tell you a bit about Valentino's writings and some of the elements of this complex figure that I think they reveal. The gentlemanly, civilized side of Valentino is clearly seen in his writing. Although both his book of poetry and his private travel diary were published with the ulterior motives of making money, of keeping his name on the public's mind, and of forwarding the image of him as a connoisseur of the arts and a sort of Italian aristocrat, there is nonetheless, to my mind, something quite sincere in these writings, which may well have had the help of one or more ghostwriters, but which nonetheless were closely supervised by Valentino himself. The book of poetry entitled Daydreams, written in English, contains some 63 poems, which were written during the period when Valentino and his wife Natasha were holding many seances, attempting to reach the other side with the help of mediums and automatic writing. Rudy's beloved mother had died in 1918, but he felt her presence and wanted to speak with her. Valentino even had his own personal spirit guide, a Native American named Blackfeather. According to Natasha, all of his poems were psychically received. The young star had a strong belief in the afterlife and the survival of the soul, as I will discuss a bit more when I present some of the main topics from his diary. The poems that he wrote or received are not particularly good, but they have the quality of sincere expressions on a variety of topics, such as the beauty of nature, the importance of family love, the power of God, the passing of time, and the need for kindness. Their titles indicate clearly the kind of poems they are. Heartflower, 3 Generations of Kisses, A Baby's Skin, Lullaby Tree, The Kaleidoscope of Love. The introductory poem sets the tone for the collection, and I quote, "I cannot tell a rondelay in words of yesterday. I cannot tell a couplet, for words come as they may. I'll do my best, I'll try a bit of ultra-modern rhyme, and cast aside the shackles binding once upon a time." Now, you can tell this is not great poetry. But I find it interesting that Valentino writes that he wants to try his hand at ultra-modern rhyme, since the poems are very old-fashioned, both in form and content. According to Natasha, his favorite poets were Byron, Georges Sand, and Walt Whitman, and we see no evidence that Valentino was reading or trying to imitate the more experimental and up-to-date modernist poets who were appearing in the 1920s in Europe and the United States. This is, after all, the era of, for example, T.S. Eliot. The poems are a rather intriguing mixture of youthful idealism and mature resignation to the passing of time and the inevitability of death. In fact, several poems are even a bit macabre in their emphasis on images of death and loss. For example, he writes of, quote, the shroud of love that once was fair, of grim death, and in a poem entitled Dust to Dust, we find, I take a bone, I gaze at it in wonder. You, O bit of strength that was, in you today I see the whited sepulchre of nothingness. We feel the pathos of these sad lines, and in other poems, the gentle hopes expressed for fulfillment in a happy love, in family, in children, in a faith in God. And we especially feel this pathos when we realize that Valentino had only 3 short years of life left to him when he was writing these verses. The book was a big success, and readers, we can assume that they were mainly women readers, treasured this glimpse into the artistic, sensitive side of the great Latin lover. I might add that it was in this period, around 1922, 1923, that Valentino really needed to make money and to keep his name in front of the public because he was in litigation with the movie-making company, Player Lasky. He wanted to break his contract with them, essentially, because they kept giving him the kinds of roles that he did not care to continue to play. And because of that litigation, he was barred from making movies for a period and had to find other ways of earning his living. He went on a dance tour, for example, with Natasha. She was a great dancer as well. And these books were very much, I think, the result of that practical need to earn some money and to keep the public aware that he was still around. Valentino's book of musings, My Private Diary is the title, was published serially in 1923 in the magazine Movie Weekly, and subsequently published as a book in England and in the US. It's a record of Rudy's first trip back to Europe in the summer of 1923, which he made in the company of his wife and her aunt, a constant companion to the young couple. So this is 10 years after he had left Italy to come to the United States, and he had not been back to Europe before this. A 1929 edition of this diary was published by the Occult Publishing Company of Chicago and contains an introduction by one Michael A. Romano, who was the assistant district attorney in Chicago and the best man at Rudy and Natasha's marriage in, of all places, Crown Point, Indiana. And at least according to his own words, Romano was a dear friend of Valentino and his wife. In Romano's introduction to the book, he calls Valentino the world's greatest lover and the king of romance. And he emphasizes how Rudy's memory is being kept alive by the Chicago Valentino Memorial Club of America. Romano highlights Valentino's many artistic interests, including painting, writing, and singing. And in fact, there are 2 recordings of Valentino singing. One of a song called Kashmiri Love Song, and another El Reliquario. And you can find these very easily on the net. They're posted here and there, probably on YouTube at this point, but also on sites that are dedicated to Valentino. And while his baritone voice is pleasant enough, it doesn't seem to be the voice of someone who trained for years as a serious singer, as Romano claims. Thus, Romano forwards the view of Valentino as a true artist and an aristocratic soul. But he also speaks of the immigrant boy, nameless, penniless, unknown, who came to seek his fortune in America, a land of golden opportunity and success. So we have here already, in a sense, contradiction, as we see throughout the characterizations of Valentino in the press, in the media in general. Because this characterization of Valentino as a young penniless boy who emigrated to the United States to seek his fortune is simply not true. I mean, he was a spoiled young middle-class man whose trip was financed by his mother. Rudy's trip back to Europe was important to him, since he wrote in his diary that it had been his long-time dream to go back as somebody. And this is written in all capital letters in the first page of the diary. This is my dream. I want to go back as somebody. Somebody who had made his mark, in other words, to go back in glory. By the year of the trip, 1923, he had indeed made his mark and become somebody. Although, interestingly, he was much less known in Europe, and especially in Italy, than he was in the United States. His own family, his own sister and brother, had never seen any of his films when he returned to Italy. His diary describes the trip from London to Paris to the Côte d'Azur and finally on to his country of origin. He drove a good part of this trip, loving to speed along in fancy cars, much to the discomfort and fear of his passengers, Natasha and her aunt, who ended up covered in road dust and completely exhausted each day that they took the fast ride with Rudy. And this is all described in great good humor in the diary. They met many people along the way, both those involved in the field of filmmaking, as well as various wealthy and prominent citizens who welcomed the young star enthusiastically, even though many of them really didn't know his films. Valentino describes the places he visits and the people he meets, but I find actually one of the most interesting aspects of this diary are the digressions, when he spins off into discussions of various topics. For example, there are lots of digressions on his interest in the occult and in spiritualism. There are also many passages about his ideas on acting and filmmaking, and there are also his meditations on the small-town Italian world that he had left as a young man. As for the first subject, the occult, he writes, quote, "I am not afraid of the dead or of ghosts. I believe in the supernatural. I believe extraordinarily in supernatural manifestations, although I personally have never seen any. It's a fact that something is within ourselves, not an organ, which we call a soul, and which cannot cease to live simply because our bodies cease to be active." In his interest in dabbling in seances and other methods of reaching the other world, Valentino reflected a widespread and popular involvement in these kinds of spurious activities, which had a hold on many well-known people, like the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Harry Houdini, the great escape artist. And interestingly, it's a fact that after Valentino died, he was sought via mediums and seances by such famous people as Mae West and Jane Mansfield. His belief in an afterlife certainly must have been conditioned by his Catholic upbringing, but his forays into the supernatural and the occult were the result of his wife Natasha's strong interest in these areas and her desire to forward a kind of esoteric aura around herself. Next, we have Valentino's digressions on the topic of acting and filmmaking, and these are quite revealing. He writes that acting for him is not just a way of earning a living, as it is for many people in the profession, but rather it is an art for which he has, quote, "the deepest awe and reverence." He goes on to write, quote, the screen is a great art, the marvelous possibilities of which have only been vaguely realized. And I will confess that it is my great ambition to make pictures that will constitute great screen art." End of quote. There are many other passages in the diary in which he talks about his real dedication to the art of acting. And we know that he tried to forward film projects that would give him a chance to show the full range of his talent. Of course, he didn't live long enough to fulfill this wish, although some critics saw real promise in his later roles, especially in The Son of the Sheik, where he plays both the Sheik and the father figure, and he's really quite good in that film. Finally, Valentino's thoughts about his origin in a small town in southern Italy, I think, are also quite revealing. It's clear that as the young adult of 1923, he saw himself as having been on a path to mediocrity had he stayed in Italy. He was already a failed soldier, a failed student of veterinary medicine, and a sort of ne'er-do-well when he took off for the U.S. at the age of 18. His words about his return to a cafe in his hometown of Castellaneta, where he hung around as a young boy, have the ring of authenticity. And I want to quote you a fairly long passage in which he describes this return. These men, these familiar faces, whom I saw to my unfeigned surprise, sitting around the same old table, in the same old indolent postures, in the same old cafe, had been young fellows of 23 or 4 when I was a mere lad of 13 or 14. At that time, they wouldn't have anything to do with me, of course, and it had been one of the ambitions of my life to be recognized by them, to be made one of them, to receive a slap on the back or a tentative confidence. It would have swelled me with pride and import. They had seemed so splendid to me then. Now, here they were in their approaching mid-30s, still sitting about the table, still talking the same language in the same way, still exchanging the same narrow and stultified ideas with the same smallness of intellect. As I watched them there from a nearby table, I realized that the luckiest thing that ever happened to me was getting away and going to America. I might so conceivably, so easily become one of them. There is nothing more persuasive than a group of good fellows, amusing talkers, idlers and pleasures, with their leisurely scorn of the more exacting things, their dilatory appreciation of a pretty ankle, a good time, a rare wine. They're like anesthesia, robbing one of willpower and the desire for effort. But as I looked at them today, after so long a span of time, I realized that while they had nearly trapped me into a life of inertia, they and what they stood for, they also had the effect of projecting me into space. For at many times I had felt stifled by the atmosphere of this town, by them, by all with whom I came into contact. Here, I think Rudolfo is describing the small town guys who are immortalized, for example, in Fellini's film I Vitelloni, or who are very similar in many ways to Martin Scorsese's young would-be mafiosi in films like Who's That Knocking at My Door or Mean Streets. They're a perennial type. The young guys dreaming of glory and power and fame, but not lifting one finger to attain them. Valentino's existential itinerary was, of course, radically different. Through a combination of good looks, sensual appeal, luck, especially with powerful women who helped him along the road, talent, and sheer hard work, Rodolfo Guglielmi became Rudolph Valentino, the heartthrob of hordes of women, and the type of male who elicited from men both slavish imitation and harsh disdain. It's no wonder that he was confused, angry, anguished, and lost when he had his short meeting with Mencken after the pink powder puff episode. He might well have been wondering how he had gotten from where he began to where he had ended up in only a few short years. Like Cary Grant, who was another construction from the raw material of Archie Leach, his real name, and who, when told once that he didn't look like Cary Grant, quipped, "Nobody looks like Cary Grant." Valentino both was and wasn't Valentino, and the real man and the created image were inextricably tangled up by the end of his short life, as is the case for those who reach stardom in whatever field. So, as we settle in to watch this short film by Eduardo Bobbidi, maybe all we can say, as the film's title says, is "Good night, Valentino," adding, "Well done, young man." Okay, so now I'd like to show you this. It's about a 12-minute film. And again, it is simply the meeting between H.L. Mencken and Valentino after this terrible, infamous article, the Pink Powder Puff article, had been published in the Chicago Tribune. You should also be aware that the movie is based on the article by Mencken, so that what we're hearing are actually the words of Mencken. None of it is made up. Okay, let me see if this will work. Turn off the lights as well.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, if you want to move around.
Becky. Good call. So this totally makes me appreciate that we studied from the other system. Because I feel smart right now. I'm tired. You're not excused. Who do you think you are? So I cry. Goodness. Scratchy.
New York is no longer a place of work. It is a place of pleasure. A town is just too full of distractions to get comfortable. An author laboring in his lonely room, the blinds down, the chewing gum plugging his ears cannot escape. Strange marvels ring up continuously. Rudolph Valentino. I had the honor of dining with this celebrated gentleman in New York a week or so before his fatal illness. I'd never met him before. In fact, I had a rule never to meet an actor if I could help it, but Valentino was in trouble. Something I had written had given him the impression that I was an enlightened and judicious fellow. That didn't surprise me. Actors hold a mirror up to nature and see only the reflection of themselves. What type of young man gets stage struck? Is he an alert, ingenious fellow? Is he a fellow with ideas in him and a yearning for hard work? No. He is, in the overwhelming main, a neighborhood fop and beau, a human clothes horse, a man with the cerebrum of a floor walker and the vanity of a bishop. Anyway, the trouble that was agitating Valentino turned out to be very simple. The New York papers were full of it. A wandering reporter out in Chicago had discovered in a men's washroom a slot machine selling talcum powder, and it was pink. The news inspired an editorial writer on the eminent Chicago Tribune to compose a hot weather editorial in which he protested against the effeminization of the American man, and he laid it to the influence of Valentino and his chic movies. Rudy, he fumed, the prototype of the American man. Why didn't somebody drown Valentino years ago? Now, hope you don't mind, I stripped off my jacket.
Not at all, it's rather hot night.
Yeah, especially for a man in tails. And Molly, that's enough for it. I hear you're very fond of this stuff. I am fond of beer in hot weather, but I am ambiguous.
What's that word?
I drink every known variety of alcoholic beverage, and I enjoy them all. So, toast.
To our health.
Here's to us. Who's like us? Damn few, so here's to us. 9/10 of the almost unanimous masculine scorn for actors is bunkum. Men dislike actors, not because they're intrinsically disgusting, but because women like them, because of jealousy. Here was a man who was catnip to women. Here was a man who lived daily the dream of millions of other young men. Here was a man who had wealth and fame, both made honorably and by his own labors, and yet here was one who was very unhappy. So, shall we sit down?
Yes.
These chairs have been especially designed by osteological engineers specializing in the structure of the human pelvis. A matchless reptile. But to get back to the matter at hand, it so happened that Valentino, passing through Chicago that day on his way to New York from the coast, ran full tilt into that editorial and into a gang of reporters who wanted to know what he had to say about it. What he had to say was full of fire. Throwing off his 100% Americanism and reverting to the mores of his fatherland, he challenged the editorial writer to a duel, and when no answer came, to a fist fight.
Why do they publish lies?
People like to read abuse.
Will you tell them the truth for me?
His masculine honor, it appeared, had been outraged to the hint that he was less than he. Even to the extent of 0.5%, there could be no answer, save a bath of blood.
You do not question a man's honor like this.
Well, there are all sorts of inflammatory stories about me, but I'm much too vain to care what such idiots think. I get this from a fellow named Little down in Union Square. Unluckily, all this took place in the United States, where the word honor, save when it is applied to the anatomical chastity of a woman, has only comic significance. One hears of the honor of politicians, of bankers, of lawyers. Naturally, everyone laughs. So when he tried to defend his honor, the world laughed at Valentino. It ascribed his high dudgeon to mere publicity seeking. He seemed only an actor grabbing space. The poor fellow, thus doubly beset, rose to dudgeon still higher. His Italian mind was quite unequal to the situation, and so he sought my counsel and comfort. Alas, in vain.
I have read what you wrote. Most of the evils that beset American journalism today are due to the stupidity, cowardice, and philistinism of the working newspaper man.
Yeah. The majority of them are ignoramuses, and I'm proud of it. Honor can never be a function of stupidity. Here was the full force of masculine vanity. The fundamental objection to actors is that they give away the idiotic vanity of the whole male sex.
What does this mean, the feminization of the American? I am an American too now, and more of a man than this creature will ever be.
He should have passed over the jibe of the Chicago journalist with a lofty snort. Perhaps better still, with a counter-jibe. But now the mischief was done. He was both insulted and ridiculous, and there was nothing whatever to do about it.
A greater insult I have never known.
Let it roll to exhaustion. Those paper men just like to stir up the animals.
It will be infamous.
Nothing is infamous that isn't true.
Suddenly, it dawned upon me. I was too dull, or it was too hot for me to see it sooner. What we were talking about was not what we were talking about at all.
Did you notice my latest picture?
That would be very nice. I can't say I've seen any of them yet, but I hear they're wonderful.
She said not to do it.
What's that?
My wife. She advised against the picture. It will be my biggest.
Man may be a hero to many, but never to his wife.
Yes.
And where is she now?
Like a light.
No, I am one of the last cigar chewers in America.
I began to observe Valentino more closely. A curiously naive and boyish young fellow. Certainly not much beyond 30, and with a disarming air of inexperience. To my eye, at least, not handsome, but nevertheless, immensely attractive. There was an obvious fineness in him. His words were simple, and yet somehow very eloquent. I could still see the mime before me, but now and then there was a flash of something else. Valentino's agony, in brief, was the agony of a civilized man thrown into situations of intolerable vulgarity. Nay, into a whole series of such situations. It was not that trifling Chicago episode that was riding him. It was the whole grotesque futility of his life. What could be more ridiculous and pathetic? I go further. It was tragic.
I think I could use another bottle.
Valentino was the hero of the rabble. Half-wits surrounded him in a dense herd. He was pursued by women, but what women? The thing at the start must have only bewildered him, but now it was revolting him. Worse, it was making him afraid. The great masses of plain people, though they admire movie actors, envy them, and hence they hate them. Had he achieved out of nothing a vast and dizzy success, then that success was hollow as well as vast, a colossal and preposterous nothing. Was he acclaimed by the multitudes, and every time the multitudes yelled, he somehow felt himself blushing inside.
I fear I've wasted your time.
No,
You'll forgive me.
no apology necessary. It's an honor to have met you. Give my regards to your wife.
Yes.
I incline to think that the inscrutable gods, in taking him off in a moment of fiery revolt, were very kind to him. Living, he would have tried inevitably to change his fame into something closer to his heart's desire. I believe he would have failed. Was the fame of Beethoven any more splendid than the fame of Valentino? Beethoven knew what it meant to be applauded. Beethoven walked away briskly. Valentino turned his face to the wall. I confess, the predicament of poor Valentino touched me. It provided grist for my mill, but I couldn't quite enjoy it. Does a man crave approbation with a sort of furious, instinctive lust? Then it is only to discover when it comes. It is somehow disconcerting. It springs in motives, offer an affront to his integrity. Here, after all, is the chiefest joke of the gods. A man must remain alone and lonely in this world, even with crowds surging about him.
Stars may come and stars may go up there in that starry space. But when one falls, God always calls a star to take its place. There's a new star in heaven tonight. It will never fade from our sight. There's a new star at home in that far starry dome, shining down on his loved ones tonight. There's a voice singing, lead kindly light, with a smile that has made the world bright. Valentino, goodbye, but way up in the sky, there's a new star in heaven tonight.
Yeah, maybe thank you so much. So, thank you, and if you, any comments or questions, or someone's just handed me a note saying that her mother was a student here at the U of C in the 20s when Valentino's fame was at its peak. But your mother preferred Harold Lloyd. That's great. Yeah.
Why did you want to make a short film like this? And where is it shown?
Well, I think that in this case, there are lots of, motives for young filmmakers to make short films. It's often they're, experimental, or they can't get funding to do a full-length film. But I think in this case, Eduardo Bobbidi really wanted to do it as a homage to Valentino. I mean, he discovered this story and he was very moved by it, and he wanted to offer it as a kind of gift to the memory of Valentino. I met Eduardo, after the actor and director, after many years. I had seen him as a tiny boy, and then I saw him a couple of years ago in Turin, where I attended and spoke at an international conference on Valentino, which was the very first conference held on Valentino in Italy. And it was a huge event. I mean, it was just the whole city of Turin was covered with posters, and there were activities that went on for weeks. All of his films were shown. There's one of the world's great cinema museums in Turin, a beautiful, beautiful place, which was entirely dedicated to a retrospective show with photographs, materials, copies of movie magazines, of the editions of his books, and so on. It was really marvelous. In any case, Eduardo was there, and he showed this film and also did a talk. And it was clear to me that he really had an emotional attachment to the sufferings of the young Valentino at the end of his life. So I think in this case it was very emotionally charged. Yeah.
Do you know if you can get the Mencken article
I think you can. I'm pretty sure you can. Yeah, and you can get the film very easily. It's published by put out by something called Indie Flicks, and I got it. I guess it must have been through Amazon or something. So if you'd like to have a copy, it's very easy to get. Yeah.
How did the affection for Valentino and when you were there in Turin compare to, say, the affection in Italy for Marcello Mastroianni or some of the other more contemporary, more recent actors?
Well, it was really an interesting experience there in Italy because it was as if it were a belated happening. That Italians felt very strongly that they needed to do homage to this important Italian, so it wasn't. I didn't feel a tremendous sense. It was mostly an academic audience, and there were papers galore on all aspects of Valentino's film career and life and so on. But my sense was more that it was almost as if there was an awareness that this was belated and that it should have been done long ago, that this homage should have been done long ago. I don't think he's a dearly beloved figure in Italy because he just simply was not a great star there. He was an American phenomenon. Although there was the funniest occurrence at this conference that I will never forget. We were in a big hall, about 3 times the size of this hall, and there was a panel up front of speakers ready to talk, and all of a sudden everything stopped. And this delegation of men, of about 4 or 5 men in black suits with black hats, fedoras, and they truly looked like something out of The Godfather, came solemnly walking up the aisle to the front of the auditorium, and it turned out it was the mayor of Castellaneta, Valentino's hometown, and his guys, his deputy mayor or whatever, and they had not been invited. Not to exclude them, but it was a scholarly conference, and they showed up. And the mayor got up on the podium and he said, "We are so ashamed that, we have not done this before in his hometown. And so we are very grateful to you, the citizens of Turin, and it had to be left to the north of Italy, to get it right." So it was a kind of north-south thing that was going on. But the most hilarious part of this was that after this very touching speech, and he said, "And by the way, we've decided that we want to put Castellaneta back on the map as the hometown of Valentino, and we have developed a perfume called Valentino, which we're going to be marketing very soon, and we have samples, And so then, at the break, the mayor and his fellows were going around spraying everything with Valentino perfume, which was really bad. I don't think it's going to have a lot of success. But that was just a tremendously interesting conference, just a marvelous, marvelous scholarly conference where, everybody learned so much about his life and works. Yeah.
How many films altogether?
I can't tell you right off the top of my head, but not a whole lot. He made several films when he was first starting out where he had bit parts, which are virtually forgotten. I mean, he just had, a little part here, a little part there. Usually they would have him play the kind of gangster type, because of his dark looks and so on. And, but of, the films by which he's remembered and by which his fame was established, I mean, you can kind of count them almost on one hand. I mean, there's the Four Horsemen, there's Monsieur Beaucaire, there's the Sheik, there's the Son of the Sheik, maybe a couple of others. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. You said that his poetry was not very good, but I'm just wondering whether he had, as we see in other poets such as Garcia Lorca, Machado, Vallejo, premonition of his own death. Do you know if anyone has studied it?
No, actually, I was the only person at the conference in Turin talking about his writings. And then it turns out there was a fellow there who was the translator of the poems and the diary into Italian. And, so we had a chance to talk a bit, but it didn't really come up, this issue of whether he felt a premonition. I mean, what's interesting is that, though, that there was all of this concentration on the occult and on reaching the other side and so on in the last few years of his life, as well as, the themes in so many of his poetry about death and loss and so on. So it's a very interesting side to his psyche. Yeah.
The film medium was so new at the time. Did he have, like any theater background or any kind of acting background?
Not at all.
Just jumped right in?
He just jumped right in.
Wow.
And he really was, I think he had a lot of natural talent as an actor. I mean, you see it, as I say, in moments in his films, but it's not just that he was exotically seductive and so on. He moves incredibly well on the screen. If you watch some of his films, as a dancer, of course, he's marvelous. The famous tango dancing and he truly is marvelous. But it's also just in the way he moves, the way he uses his body on screen, which was quite exceptional for that time. Because
did he have any dance background?
Well, no. I mean, when he came to New York, he just became a taxi dancer. He was penniless and he needed money, and he was palling around with some other young guys, and they said, well, look, you can go and dance at various hotel ballrooms and make money.
So it's just a natural.
So it's kind of a natural, yeah. And but I am impressed by his acting skills. I mean, I think he really had something, and I think he could have become. I don't agree with Mencken. Mencken has this thing about if he kept on, he never would have reached his dream. I think it's possible he might have. I think he might have been able to do more and more serious roles, and perhaps, at least become, well, kind of like Marilyn Monroe, if we want to take the female version of this kind of incredible rise to fame. Yeah, I mean, she was a pretty darn good actress, right? As well as being Marilyn Monroe. So I think that Valentino maybe could have done it. Yeah.
Was he totally before talkies?
No.
Okay, so I was thinking it would depend on his voice, but I guess
No. In fact, his movies, I think at least a couple are talkies. I mean, several of them are not, but I don't think that would have been a problem for him. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a comment and a question. To answer that gentleman's question of how many films Valentino made, one could go to Internet movie database and just type in.
Sure.
Valentino would do a search and you'd get a list of all of them.
Everything. Right.
Now my question, there's an anecdote I've heard that Valentino spent his wedding night or his wedding nights with a man. Is that correct, Lisa?
Well, we still don't know, the intimate details of Valentino's life, but evidently it is true that his first marriage was a true disaster and that it was never consummated. I think that he himself said that his wife, Jean Acker, locked him out of the bedroom on their first night together, and they just never got together. There's also, a lot of evidence that he was not in life really what he appeared to be on screen. He was not a tremendous ladies' man. He loved women, and he loved women of all ages, and women really helped him in his career. But he was not a seducer of women, he wanted a family. I mean, he at least, you know, the materials that we have suggest that he genuinely wanted to have kids, that he really did like to cook, you know, that he retained a lot of his small town, you know, ideals, and it just never worked out for him. The question of his, you know, bisexuality or homosexuality or whatever is just, it's so wrapped up with his image, you know, as I was attempting to suggest to you. So it's very hard to know. It's very hard to know the truth of that. The same is true, by the way, for Cary Grant. I mean, I went to another great conference and tour on Cary Grant about 5 years ago, and Cary Grant also, you know, in the press was accused, as was done in those days, of homosexuality, living with Randolph Scott and so on. You know, but these things are very hard to sort out from the myth and the so on. Yeah.
Was that reporter ever identified?
Yeah. His name I can't remember now, but it was just a hack reporter. You know, it wasn't anybody of any real significance.
Nobody famous.
Nobody famous. No. Well, thank you very, very much. Really, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.